Eccoci qua. Good morning, everyone, and welcome Robin Brooks on Drin-Drin. Alberto.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so warning everybody, this will be in English as, well, Robin actually knows Italy. He just told us beautiful things about Italy. But he even speak Italian.
Poco poco.
Un poco poco. Alberto joins us from Boston today, so we are actually close. We're all close. Washington, Boston, St. Louis. I'm in the provinces. They are in the main capital. So given that Alberto is in the main capital, I'll let Alberto lead the show. Sir?
Well, thank you, Robin. We would like to hear about Russia sanctions and how to go around sanctions. How it works. But before we start, tell us something about yourself and how you end up being an expert in the field.
Okay, thanks Alberto and Michele for having me on. It's a real treat. I usually don't do very much productive things on a Sunday morning, so this is an exception. And it's a pleasure to be with you. I am a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank here in DC. I was until recently the chief economist at the IIF, which is a trade association for banks and asset managers and hedge funds and private equity. And before that, I was the chief foreign exchange strategist at Goldman in New York. So I'm an expert basically in international finance. I woke up on February 24th, 2022, the morning that Russia invaded Ukraine, with great dismay, I think, as everybody else. And like everybody else, I've been following the news since then, and have been doing lots of work on the economic countermeasures that the West can use. Obviously, the West can help Ukraine on the battlefield with equipment and with money. But the most important thing, in my opinion, is that Russia and Russia's economy is basically a one-trick pony. That's an expression for it basically does one thing. The late Senator John McCain here in the United States was on a visit to Ukraine after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. And he came back to Washington and he said, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country. And that's true. It basically exports energy. And that gives Russia a current account surplus. So that's basically money flowing into Russia all the time, hard currency, dollars and euros. And that money allows Putin to successfully wage war in Ukraine. If that flow of money stops, then Russia would go into a deep financial crisis. It would immediately have a large devaluation. As a result, it would have to raise interest rates very sharply. It would have high inflation, maybe hyperinflation, and the economy would basically collapse because financial conditions, interest rates would go up and tighten financial conditions so much. So as someone who works on international finance, my focus has been, how can we punish Russia's economy as much as possible? How can we hurt the economy as much as possible to punish Putin for this invasion of Ukraine and make the war much more difficult for Putin to fight, and perhaps bring about even an end to the war because the Russian economy goes into collapse. So that has always been my interest. And I am convinced that the West has the means to do this, but the West has not used its means. And I'll talk about why. So let me talk a little bit about what's happened and why things are not working.
Right. You've been documenting. I mean, one thing that impressed us is, the professionality and detail with which you document some of the bypassing, the most egregious bypassing of sanctions. So that would be.
So I'll talk about that in a second. So, but let me just say a couple things about the sanctions that we have. So you will know that in the days right after the invasion, the West imposed financial sanctions. So that means barring certain Russian banks from doing business with the West. It means excluding some Russian banks from communications services like SWIFT. But none of these financial sanctions work. Why? Because we only sanctioned some Russian banks, not all. And so all we did with our financial sanctions is we forced the flows, so the dollars and the euros that are constantly coming into Russia for its energy exports. We just sent those dollars and euros via the unsanctioned banks in place of the sanctioned banks. So really, our financial sanctions just picked winners and losers in the Russian financial system. They did not stop the flow of money to Russia, and thus they didn't hurt Russia at all. So they were a complete waste of time. The obvious solution to that problem is to sanction all Russian banks. And so think about the implication of that. If you sanction all banks, it becomes impossible to pay Russia for its energy. So it's equivalent to a full energy embargo. And that tells you what is needed to hurt Russia and to hurt Putin. You need to focus on trade, not on financial sanctions. The West did two things on trade. And so now I'm going to come to the exports, Michele, which you just mentioned. It did the G7 oil price cap. So that is a trade measure because it allows Russian oil to come to the market, but it gives a cap on the price of oil that Putin gets. And the hope is that therefore the current account surplus is less. There have been huge problems with the G7 oil price cap, which I'll talk about in a second. And then there are Western export controls, obviously on sensitive goods like microchips and all kinds of military equipment. And there are two big issues with those export controls, which I'll talk about also. One is China. China has massively increased its exports to Russia. It's become Russia's biggest trading partner by far. China is obviously not subject to the export controls or any of the Western measures. And so that is obviously massive support for Russia's economy and the war. And then second, Western companies across Europe are exporting to Central Asia and the Caucasus in massive amounts. And when you aggregate all that up, every single EU country is exporting to every single country in Central Asia, every single country in the Caucasus, every single country in the Soviet satellite sphere, including Belarus. So when you total all those numbers up, they're big. So I'll talk about that too. Let me just talk about the G7 oil price cap first for 1 second, because I think it's really, really important. The Russian economy has a massive vulnerability. It exports oil. It has very little storage capacity. So actually in Russia, if oil comes out of the ground, it has to go on a ship pretty much right away. There is no storage, okay? So the West controls the vast majority of the oil tanker business. And Europe controls the vast majority of that business because Greek shipping magnates have a huge number of oil tankers. When Putin first invaded Ukraine, Greek-owned oil tankers were about 60% of total oil tanker capacity out of Russian ports. So the most disastrous thing that has happened on the G7 oil price cap is that Greek shipping magnates lobbied very hard in Brussels. They lobbied very hard the EU to soften up the G7 oil price cap as much as possible. They didn't like it because they thought Putin would not give them his business. And then even worse, these shipping magnates sold a lot of their oil tankers to shadowy interests, to what we call the shadow fleet, which basically now is transporting oil on behalf of Putin out of Russia. It's a disaster. The EU should have prohibited the sale of these oil tankers a long time ago. It did not. Why? Because these Greek shipping magnates have a lot of influence on the Greek government. The Greek government lobbied Brussels. Nothing happened. And so the EU here on the G7 oil price cap is a guilty party in terms of facilitating basically the continued export of oil outside of the G7 oil price cap, and it's self-defeating. This is a major threat to Europe, as far as I'm concerned. As someone who's,
I mean, let me interrupt you. This is an argument I heard you develop. I mean, I read you developing, and it seems pretty confirmed by the fact and whatever. Let's call it economic, logical things. Let me push it deep. And yes, please, if you don't want to answer this because this requires private information that has to do with your job or things, don't worry about it. But I'm a bit flabbergasted by the inability of the European Commission to hold straight on this and allowing for this rather obvious at the end, bypassing what theoretically is a set of sanctions they should care about, and they've put their reputation on the line. That's the political part of it. I understand even less.
Yep.
It's a bit like, I mean, I had a discussion exactly yesterday. You probably know who Francesco Giavazzi is. And with Francesco, that was insisting that von der Leyen is now reversing on electric cars transition because she's realized it doesn't work. And I wonder how they take momentous decision like that, 35 transition or accelerated transition or electrified transition to electricity, or okay, we put sanction into Russia, we're gonna be tough, and then let this thing actually don't work in fairly, how can I say, trivial ways, it is, hey, Robin, you want to play baseball tomorrow? Yeah, sure. Well, no, Robin, sorry, I just changed my mind. Even that would not be very polite, but at least it would be between you and me. What's your view?
It's a great question. So to me, I'm 53. I've seen a lot of the world. I thought I knew how the world works. This is a big shock. And it turns out when you have big shocks, you learn how the world actually works. And to me, it has been a lesson in how the EU works. And as you know, Alberto and Michele, member states in the EU have a veto over important decisions, in particular on foreign policy. Hungary has been using that very effectively and harmfully to the EU. And it turns out that other member states that have these big shipping sectors like Greece, but not just Greece, Malta and Cyprus as well, have been threatening to use their veto to soften up these measures. Now, do I think that is the full story? No, I don't think so at all. In the end, Greece, as you know, is a pretty small economy. We don't even have to talk about Malta and Cyprus. These are tiny parts of the EU, right? The EU is a 27-country bloc, 450 million people. Am I really supposed to believe that these three countries are holding up effective enforcement? No, I think the bigger countries are hiding behind them. And I think, honestly, Michele, to your question, the European response on sanctions, whether it is the G7 oil price cap or the enforcement of export controls, is super half-hearted. And that reflects a lot of the political economy that you guys focus on, the links that exist in politics to Russia, perhaps fear of being more stronger on the implementation of these things. So I think there's a big political economy. There is dysfunction in the EU on defending European interests. There is much too much power that is given to the individual member states, and it becomes a major issue if a member state like Greece, a tiny country in the EU, is dominated by one sector. That sector basically gets a veto right in EU decision making. It's completely dysfunctional. Can you imagine in the United States if Rhode Island had a veto power over where we send an aircraft carrier? It's nonsensical, right? It for good reason doesn't happen. And that basically is the situation in the EU. Now, I don't want to make it sound like the Greeks are the only people here that are a factor. If you look at exports of cars, exports of machinery, exports of electrical equipment, as you know, Germany is a massive producer of these things. German exports to an out-of-the-way place like Kyrgyzstan, which has never been a hub for global transportation. German exports to Kyrgyzstan of these key components are up about 5,000% from before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Is there any rational explanation for all these goods being consumed in Kyrgyzstan? Absolutely not, right? They're obviously being transshipped to Russia. And so what is most likely happening, Alberto and Michele, you asked about the mechanics here. Most likely what is happening is that there are a kind of shell company in places like Georgia or Armenia or Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. These shell companies are placing orders with German business. The German business exports to these places. Of course, if you're filling the order, the volume increases in these orders are so massive, I would suspect that German business knows exactly what's going on. It's just, people want to make money. It's the same thing as with the Greeks. And so this stuff is ongoing. As you know, I'm pretty active on Twitter. I have posted some of these German data, which really look terrible. And a friend of mine looped in the German Customs Service, who responded to their credit within a couple of hours, and they said, we've looked at these individual transactions and they're all okay. And so what is missing in Germany and in many other EU countries, Poland, Czech Republic, all of the Baltics, where these exports are up similarly, is a top-down view where someone at the very top, at the political level, says, "Hey, stop exporting all this stuff to Kyrgyzstan. This is not a complicated decision, right? Just stop it." And that.
Let me step in, Alberto. Step in whenever you feel Robin is a true machine. A question. I've tried to look at Italy, and when I haven't checked with my lawyers. I got enough. In Italy, they quereli you, they sue you, even if you say that the water is wet and the fire burns, as long as the politician believes that's not appropriate for his. So I promised my lawyers to make them earn less. And so I have to check if I have to say this explicitly. But the bottom line is the number of firms that are actually involved in this are relatively limited. Apart from the Danieli story that is quite public, there are a few that have to do with equipment, parts, materials, and then there are some marginal ones that export food, basically processed thing. I suppose this is not so different in other countries, right? Which makes the thing even more puzzling, right?
Yes.
Because none of them has, the Greek armatori, the Greek ship owners are huge respect to the economy of Greece, but even Mercedes, which doesn't really export as far as I know, is not that big respect to the economy of Germany. What are we talking about here? Are we talking, in your view, some possible corruption? Because I don't think a political economy argument would work. This is not enough votes to account for that. It's a bit like the Tassisti thing in Italy again. Italy, from this point of view, is an example. Right? We have a lot of experience of small groups inflicting major social cost. What's your view? I don't know if Alberto has some view on this.
Well, let me say a couple things if Alberto wants to chip in. But remember the start of the war in Germany, which I follow closely. I mean, Germany had a big debate on a full energy embargo. And the CEOs of some of the major companies, so BASF, for example, big chemicals company, which you both know, came out very forcefully that this would fundamentally harm the competitiveness of Germany. It would cause him to move his business overseas, and therefore employment in Germany would fall sharply. So these are the kind of scare stories that people like to tell. And of course, it's a scary scenario. Usually it's very vague. It's not backed up by any hard analysis. And most importantly, it is a false counterfactual because take Germany. The perfect situation for Germany, it has all this infrastructure to transport Russian energy, right? Think of Nord Stream 1, think of Nord Stream 2. What is the perfect scenario for Germany to come out of this terrible war in Ukraine? It is to be as hard as possible, as sharp as possible in the implementation of sanctions and economic countermeasures of Russia, to cause Russia to have an economic crisis, hyperinflation, deep recession, the Russian population rises up against Putin, there's regime change, and then Germany can go back to importing cheap Russian energy. That's the dream scenario. So when people advocate against harsher sanctions, they are focused very much on short-term profits and telling scare stories. And of course, that comes at a cost to society. Michele, you were just saying, these small groups, they can have significant cost to society. So the cost to society is we now have a 2-year war in Ukraine. We have no end in sight. We have a US election, which is around the corner. US support is potentially in question. And it is possible that Russia will prevail in Ukraine, which would be a disastrous scenario for European industry, for the European population, European democracy. So going back to your question, what is going on in the EU? I think there has to be, after this big shock where we learn how things really work in Brussels and in the member states and at the government level, we have to, people like you, Alberto, and me, we have to be quite vocal about some of the decisions that were taken, some of the decisions that were not taken. We have to shine as much light on them as possible. That is why I'm so active tweeting what is going on, both in terms of what the influence of Greek ship owners are, who I like to call Greek oligarchs, and European exporters. The more that this comes out, the more people will understand and ask questions to their governments and to Brussels. The reality is the reporting in the popular press is very limited on this. And that's understandable, right? This makes governments look bad. It makes the EU look bad. And so there's a penalty on journalists to report on this issue, right? Because if you report negative stories about the EU, it's going to probably be hard to get a meeting in Brussels. And so I think it's incumbent on, us. So I'm a German citizen and a proud believer in the EU. And I think it is really important that besides obviously confronting Russia as forcefully as we can, we do some serious thinking about the decision making and the processes in our institutions, so that if there's another conflict with an autocrat, we're better prepared. The way things are going here, it's not good.
Robin, let's go back to the question of the oligarchs, the Greek oilmen shipping the oil. I'm quite aware of it. What should have the EU done? What should the EU have done to prevent it?
So remember, there is a rumor in Washington, D.C. that the oil price cap is actually Mario Draghi's idea. Draghi came to visit the White House. All good ideas come from Italy, maybe.
Not to say of the bad ones.
Draghi came to the U.S. to visit the White House and Biden, and in early 2022, after the invasion, and is rumored to have suggested to Biden, hey, why don't we do this cap? You know, that could be a way to hurt Russia economically without disrupting the supply of oil to the global economy and thus hurting the global economy. So at that point, preparations in the US Treasury and other governments started. Over the summer, as these preparations were ongoing, in Washington, the rumor was that the oil price cap would be set around $50 per barrel. Now, remember, that was when the oil price actually was around $120, $125. It would have been a massive shock, okay, if that had happened. What ended up happening by December of that year, the oil price had fallen. There was an increasing spread between the Urals oil price and the global Brent oil price benchmark. So the Urals oil price by the end of 2022 was around $60 a barrel. Greek lobbying and Cypriot lobbying and Maltese lobbying had pushed up this $50 number to 60. And so the implementation of the G7 oil price cap ended up being a complete non-event, when what the West should have done and what the EU should have done, we want a shock value. We want to show we mean business. As you know, Alberto, right? If you want to have an impact on markets, you need a surprise. And this was unfortunately completely missed. And it is the first thing that the Greek ship owners and the Greek government really did to disrupt things materially. You will remember that at the time, there were discussions within different parts of the EU. So the Baltics and Poland in particular were in favor of an aggressive oil price cap around $30 a barrel. Some people say even lower. And it was Greece, Malta, and Cyprus that argued for a high cap. And unfortunately, they ended up prevailing. So this was entirely, basically, horse trading within the EU that messed things up. Besides that, now, that was just the starting point, right? And you could have subsequently lowered the cap. You could have made it more aggressive. You could have, 1 month after the implementation, said, you know what? It was 60, but we're going to cut it to 40 now because the Urals oil price has fallen. But that didn't happen because basically Greece and the other ship-owning countries threatened to use their veto. And so we've basically been in sort of rigor mortis on this issue. Nothing has happened.
Okay, so the lobbying power of the Greek oil man had to do with the price of oil.
Yes.
Okay, clear. Okay.
And while all this is happening, Greek ship owners or Greek oligarchs were selling oil tankers to the shadow fleet all the time. This is almost even worse because
absolutely,
because it fundamentally makes the ability of the G7 oil price cap to bite and to hurt Russia. It fundamentally undercuts that. You can argue over the level of the cap. That's always something you can fix, but you can't fix necessarily in the short term the sale of these oil tankers to Russia.
Yeah, clear.
So unfortunately,
the other thing is clear. Is there other things that you seem to know something about, most mechanical and other parts going through instead these mid-Asia or Central Asia countries?
so
to what extent do you think we are actually feeding the war machine?
So I only observe macro data. So I don't observe, the car with the microprocessor being shipped to Bishkek and then going from Bishkek to Moscow. I don't observe that transaction. I only observe export volumes going through the roof in completely unexplainable ways, and the only rational explanation is that this stuff is being transshipped to Russia. Now, what I can say is the following. In the EU, every country is doing this, but the most important are Germany, Poland, the Baltics, Czech Republic. So the further east you go in the EU, the worse it gets. In Central Asia and the Caucasus, the countries that are most heavily involved are, relative to the size of their economies, are Armenia, Georgia, and Kyrgyzstan. So again, it's perfectly clear what is going on. The data are readily available. So Alberto, again, to your question, why is nothing being done? The solution here is obvious. The solution is, in my opinion, that you sanction one of these countries. So pick Kyrgyzstan, for example. It's not relevant for global trade. There are no financial linkages, so contagion would be absent. It is a government that is sympathetic to Moscow. So you put sanctions on them. And I think what would happen is this transshipment trade would collapse across the region, because all of a sudden governments would realize, holy cow, the West is serious about policing this. And I'm putting myself and my country, whether it's Armenia or Georgia or Kazakhstan, I'm putting my country at serious risk of disruption here.
Yeah, but the law of transshipment is going through Turkey, which is much more difficult to sanction, and the Serbia, which is even having discussion to join the EU. So difficult to police the transshipment. I'm not even sure there are. If you transship, you violate no rules at all.
Unless secondary sanctions are imposed.
So I think Alberto raises...
That seems to be the point.
Alberto, you're raising a good question. If we impose sanctions on Kyrgyzstan, would transshipment just go via somewhere else? Would trade just shift and Moscow ends up getting the same goods that it was before? This is the fundamental problem. I think it means two things, in my opinion. First, the absolute most important thing is the G7 oil price cap. You have to reduce the amount of cash that Russia is getting. That will reduce the ability to buy stuff. Second, if you sanction Kyrgyzstan, there are two possibilities. The trade, the exports that went to Kyrgyzstan now flow through, as you said, Serbia or Armenia or Georgia, whatever. But the other option is that German companies and countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus realize, oh my God, we may be at serious risk here, and the trade goes down across the board. I am willing to believe at the current juncture, because we haven't done anything really, that the second effect is more important, and we just need to do something, and we're not doing anything.
Now, the conclusion I draw from this is no, but before I say this, that also gas. There is an issue with gas because we still buy a considerable amount of gas from Russia. The flow of gas has not stopped at all. If the flow of gas had to stop, we would be in deep trouble because we wouldn't know how to substitute the gas coming from Russia. So
why, Alberto? The data. So the data I've seen that the amount of gas coming from Russia is really extremely small.
No.
And given current market conditions, is there something that I'm missing?
No, it's not small, Michele. It's not small at all.
I think for some countries it's still material. So Austria, I think, depends heavily on Russian gas still. But in the case of Germany, the dependence is zero, basically. LNG is a different issue. Russia is still exporting lots of LNG to the EU.
Yeah. So the data I have says that it's about 8% of the total. It's a bit higher with LNG. So overall Europe, I mean, not Italy or the big countries.
But still substituting 8% is a problem. Now, for example, the irony of this is all that gas is going through Ukraine.
Yes.
This is not an ironical thing.
Yep. So my 2 cents on all this is Russia, going back to the late Senator John McCain, it's a gas station masquerading as a country, okay? Oil is its single biggest export. The value of the ruble depends on the current account surplus. It depends on the daily flow of hard currency to Russia. If we do something to disrupt that by prohibiting the EU, if tomorrow the EU announces all sales of oil tankers to undisclosed buyers and to shadowy interests are prohibited, and if tomorrow the EU announces, you know what, we're going to cut the G7 oil price cap from 60 to 30, the ruble would fall a lot. Russia's economy would go probably into a tailspin, or it would not be doing as well as on some of the statistics it looks like it's doing, although I think those are doubtful. So we can do something. We have lots of power. We're just not using it because of our own internal dysfunction, and perhaps because we are afraid to do something. So I think that is the most important thing. And I think the gas thing that you're saying, it's true. Some parts of Europe still depend on it, but we can really hurt Russia.
No, the question is, Robin, the conclusion I draw from this discussion is it is very difficult for a democracy to wage a war in today's world. And it's even more difficult if you have a representative entity like the EU. But even for a single country, it's very difficult to wage war. Look at the United States.
Right. I think the point still stands. I mean, the United States makes decisions on an executive basis pretty quickly. And if it decides, it can send an aircraft carrier quickly. The difference is Rhode Island doesn't have a veto. And that is the thing in the EU that is completely dysfunctional, because in the European Rhode Island, which is Greece, that country is dominated by one industry. And we've basically given that industry veto power. It's the same with the German exporters, which have disproportionate importance for German decision-making. So that has to get fixed. We can't have decision-making on a foreign policy level that goes like that. And that's not a U.S. problem, I think. Alberto, would you agree?
No, I mean, the U.S. problem has to do with the power of the Speaker of the House that doesn't allow the financing of Ukraine. It doesn't bring to the floor the bill to finance Ukraine. There's another sort of bottleneck, but it's a bottleneck. Altogether, democratic country cannot, in the current state, with all the safeguards, all the constitutional safeguards and so on, it's very difficult for a democratic country to wage a war and especially to win a war.
And the thing again, these economic measures that I've been so focused on, whether it's export controls or the G7 oil price cap, that's not actually war. It's not putting any boots on the ground, right? It is about making the Russian economy suffer with our economic power. And we are not using that power because basically of vested interests and their lobbying power. That has to be something that is fixable at the EU level.
Let's get on the EU. I think it's apparent from what Robin illustrated and also the things that Alberto said about gas and so on that we're probably kidding or something like that. But we are kidding on an issue which is a matter of life and death, not only for thousands and tens of thousands Ukrainians, but probably if it keeps going this way, also for other people in Europe. And it's certainly a matter of independence, of national independence and collective independence, of freedom. And as we have seen, the effort of Russia being able to control or condition economic policies in satellite countries of poverty versus well-being. So the issue that Alberto raised is democracies have a hard time waging wars. Mm-hmm. Correct. But there is war. What's your thought? What the people like us, that small political impact, but it's a little bit of an audience, a little bit of a well-informed, well-educated people listening. What should be done? Where is the angle, in your view, Robin, that these things can be taken? The European election are coming in about 4 months? 3 months. March, April, May. It's beginning of June. All right, so 3 months. How would you look at it if you were? Well, you are a European citizen. If you were in Europe, participating in some form.
So. There has to be transparency and accountability on these decisions. That's the single most important thing. Where I'm so glad to be on your podcast is there really isn't enough discussion in Europe about how things are working. When I talk to my parents who live outside of Frankfurt, most of these issues they're completely unaware of.
No, yeah, you're right.
And the role that Greece has played in Brussels, who's going to know that? Nobody. The role that exports are playing through Central Asia, all these things are pretty esoteric. And so
they are. I agree. Well, that's why we're talking about them, to make them less esoteric.
Exactly. So where I'm so grateful to both of you, it is really important to flag this stuff. In general, I think, unfortunately, and I'm a proud European. I'm a proud supporter of the euro. I'm from Frankfurt. I was very proud that the ECB ended up being in Frankfurt. But again, I observe things that are reducing transparency, not improving transparency at the ECB level. And I think where the common underlying denominator is in all of this is that the EU and the Eurozone, all this these constructs are weak. We have populism that is rising across Europe. And so sort of the knee-jerk response among policymakers is to reveal less and to hide more. And it is exactly the wrong instinct. I think there has to be debate. There has to be debate on the value of the euro. There has to be debate on what the ECB is doing in terms of buying of bonds. The data on that have to be published at high frequency and high transparency. That's not the case currently. And so that people who are in favor of the euro, like me, can make clean arguments and can rebut populists in Germany who say, this is going in the wrong direction, or populists in Italy who say Italy would be much better off outside of the euro. The only way we can rebut these things is by showing exactly how things are working. And so, the real value of the podcast that you guys are doing, and I want to say a big thank you for having me on. We have to raise the awareness of these things. And so I think you both are making a great contribution.
Alberto, how do you see that? Let me bring you a bit into
No,
that.
I think we know, Robin, we have a problem with the EU. The question of the single country having veto power is polluting the whole decision-making process outside of the war with Russia. It's a huge problem everywhere. The EU is weak. So democracy is weak. The EU is especially weak. You're expecting too much. I think Michele and I are listening to you, but I'm sort of surprised you expect so much from the EU. And the EU will not change in time to win the war. That's for sure.
Yes, I think.
Before giving the word to Robin, and actually by adding, if you want to elaborate a bit also on the economic side of all this and your view, please go ahead. I know you have a deadline in about 8 minutes, so take all the time. Let me add. Alberto is the cynic between the two of us. My brain tends to agree. My heart or emotions or whatever desire tends to think that we cannot lose the war. Alberto is saying that we cannot win, that if we don't win, we lose. We had a conversation with Romano Prodi about that, and losing is not a good outcome. So I hope our brains are wrong. But please go ahead.
So first of all, I am grateful to both of you for your questions. And Alberto, I completely understand where you're coming from, and perhaps I'm being naive in thinking that transparency will cause this big leap forward. I think we're having two discussions. One is a discussion about what can Europe do to help Ukraine on a pretty short horizon, because the horizon is not that long, right? We may have elections later on this year in the United States and everything changes, right? And God knows what happens in Ukraine if the government changes here in the United States. It could be that morale in the Ukrainian armed forces collapses, and God knows what happens then, right? It could be quite scary. And I think the sense of urgency on that in Europe is lacking. And I think that could be a good idea for a future podcast for the two of you, to just have someone on to talk about the worst case scenario. What if Ukraine 1 year from now is completely occupied and the war is over? So that is one idea, and I think it's not being taken seriously enough in Europe, and it would set a terrible precedent in terms of the West vis-a-vis other autocracies and how we deal collectively in our decision making. And then I think, Alberto, you're completely right. The things that I'm talking about in terms of European decision making, the veto power and so forth, these are, larger design things that in Europe we need to debate over, 10 years, the medium term, whatever. But that debate has to start.
I know.
This is the catalyst. This decision making is broken. It is a mess. We are protecting people who are making money, who are extremely rich, who are extremely privileged, who probably send their kids to school here in the United States, not in Europe. And that has to stop. We should be focusing on the interests of the people. And again, I think that starts by just generating as much visibility. I'm grateful. In the last 3-4 months, my tweets on this export thing, I think, have moved the needle a bit. So I've been doing lots of press recently. The visibility on this is growing. No decisions have at the policy level happened, but I think the awareness on the issue is growing. I've been pounding the drum on the Greek oligarchs. Again, the press coverage on that is rising. The awareness is rising. There has to be this moment of collective shame in policy circles. We haven't reached that yet.
I tell you, Robin, what the most likely scenario would be. We will lose the war in Ukraine. The US will not fund Ukraine. Trump will be elected. And that shock, the combined shock of Trump being elected, and
I'm going to kick him out.
Will force us some change. Something.
So now you're invoking catastrophe to make the change.
Yeah, to make the change, you need the big scare. And the scenario which is coming up is a big scare.
You mean like Argentina? That's the way Argentina improved its economy, and it's because they've had so many disasters during the century that. In fact,
wait. Argentina is still not the case yet. They're not there yet.
I was trying to be ironic, Alberto.
Well, okay.
Well, okay, we have a nice forecast. Let's give the last word to Robin. So let's see what he says about it. Alberto has pictured a scenario which is fascinating. By 2000, actually, there is Trump, and so it's within a year, in your view, Alberto.
Yeah, end of year. We will lose Ukraine. There will be the big scare.
I'm going to take a bet that, in spite of everything negative we said, and I agree, and all the risk, this is not going to happen, because that disaster you portrayed would induce only one change. Europe will become a rich, well-educated, for a while, temporarily, and somewhat better, how can I say, touristically endowed than Uzbekistan.
Let me give the one pushback to Alberto's scenario, which I feel strongly about, which is Ukrainians, the courage of Ukrainians, the willingness of Ukrainians to fight and not run for the hills. I mean, it's incredible. Remember the first days of the war, when that Russian convoy was heading down towards Kiev? We thought the war would be over within days. And it's not, because the Ukrainians have had such courage. So I think that the political change, if it happens here in the United States, obviously would be a major setback, but I am not sure the future, any positive outcome hangs on the courage of the Ukrainians, and unfortunately the terrible sacrifices that they're having to make. But boy, my hats are off to them, and my heart goes out to them.
Mine too. Thank you, Robin.
Wonderful to be with both of you. Thanks for having me on.
Yes.
Grazie mille.
This is very interesting. We're already reading a few hundred people saying, "I love this Robin. Please make him come back. We will try. He's a busy man, as you may have
Facciamo
known.
così.
But we would welcome you back. And in fact, maybe in a few weeks, we can get back a bit more on the EU economy, which was one of the plans today, but then we stuck to the most urgent, and maybe your view on the American elections, that the followers are following also with a bit of anxiety, because Alberto has this beautiful forecast, very optimistic.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Grazie.
Have a good day.
Ciao.
Thanks for the company.
Ciao.
Thank you. Take
Grazie
care.
mille.
Bye-bye. All right. Va bene, gioventù. Allora, spero che si sia capito. Abbiamo parlato, direi, abbastanza lentamente. C'era parecchia gente. Ci sono ancora 555 persone che invito a mettere i like. Io non scappo con questa rapidità. Invito a mettere i like. Te la sei persa o non hai ricevuto notifica? Non importa. Frank Bell Tower, vai su YouTube e la vedi, è aperta. E mi raccomando, mettete i like. I problemi che Robin ha posto sono seri. sono veri e credo che sì, che parte del pessimismo di Alberto ci stia, ma insomma va bene lo stesso. Ecco, vorrei far notare una cosa in chiusura. Dopo, infatti, mi è venuta la tentazione oggi di fare un piccolo video in piedi con le tiracche, che c'ero anch'io messo così, con le tiracche, parlarvi, dicendovi delle cose con un po' di R, ed è il giochetto della, come dire, la psicologia del vigliacco. Il vigliacco è colui il quale vuole stare sempre col vincitore, e quindi occhio alla continua diffusione del messaggio abbiamo perso, siamo deboli, eccetera. Il messaggio che dice questo è un errore, questo ci danneggia, questi fanno i loro interessi, non è un messaggio che vuol dire che va tradotto in abbiamo comunque perso perché siamo deboli e pieni di traditori, ma è un messaggio che dice occorre darsi da fare per vincere, occorre darsi da fare di più, non stiamo facendo abbastanza ma siamo in grado di farlo. In Italia oramai c'è uno scatenamento nelle ultime settimane di messaggi che dicono l'Ucraina ha perso, ha ceduto, eccetera. Vi invito a guardare i fatti. L'Ucraina è stata molto massacrata e distrutta, ma l'Ucraina non ha perso. Non ha proprio perso. Dal punto di vista dei costi militari sono platealmente maggiori quelli russi. E occhio, quando l'URSS è crollato all'improvviso, quando sono scappati dall'Afghanistan erano lì da 10 anni. Quindi non è assolutamente vero che l'Ucraina ha perso, e chi con le tiracche e l'R moscia va a spiegare che ha perso e che bisogna fare le trattative subito, come qualche deficiente filorusso prima di dire bisogna fare le trattative di pace. Di pace con chi? Con uno che non ha nessuna intenzione di farle e continua a bombardare i civili, grandissimo figlio di puttana. Tanto che non ci sono gli altri, posso aggiungere io, no? Quindi, signori, di fronte alle difficoltà, di fronte alle debolezze, occorre chiedersi what's at stake, e quello che è at stake è platealmente, sempre più platealmente, dalle dichiarazioni proprio dei leader russi, dell'ubriacone Medvedev, perché è alcolizzato e gli scappiano le frasi, perché gli hanno assegnato il ruolo di quello che minaccia, ma anche del grande e freddo e calcolatore capo Putin, oltre che del pagliaccio mentitore professionale Lavrov. Esce chiaramente qual è il piano e qual è l'obiettivo. Sì, Rampini dice minchiate apodittiche da decenni, lo so, e le poche cose corrette che ha scritto è perché le aveva scopiazzate dai giornali americani, come documentammo più di 15 anni fa, 16 anni fa, 17 anni fa, 18 anni fa, su Noi from America, Sandro Brusco, io e gli altri, provandolo. Certo che sì, però il problema è che la gente lo ascolta. E quindi il punto di essere una minoranza è però attiva, è proprio questo. Ecco, non farsi scaraventare nel pessimismo cosmico, Marco Paleari, che su X è molto attivo e dice cose sagge. Non bisogna, proprio non bisogna, anche perché i fatti obiettivi non lo sono. E vale per questo, lasciate che lo dica, per l'altro problema mi sta a cuore. Siete sempre più passivi e state sempre di più accettando una sconfitta storica gigantesca, non militare e umana, per quello che sta accadendo in Gaza. State accettando che Israele faccia praticamente, abbia messo alla fame, alla disperazione, alla follia centinaia di migliaia di persone, forse milioni. Siamo ridotti alla più grande potenza militare mondiale che, essendo incapace di piegare la violenza folle scatenata da Israele per vendetta, a questo punto è solo e pura vendetta, ok? Si riduce a fare i lanci aerei di cibo, 35.000, pensa che roba, a fronte di milioni di persone che stanno di fatto morendo di fame. È tempo di provare, a fronte del pessimismo che induce lo stato del mondo, provare ad avere un po' di dignità, proprio avere un po' di dignità e anche di coraggio, E quindi questa riflessione che faccio alla fine di questa riflessione collettiva, è il caso di avere, e me ne assumo la responsabilità personale. Io credo che le previsioni che fa Alberto siano uno degli scenari possibili, ed è lo scenario peggiore, non è lo scenario certo, non so neanche se è il più probabile, ma in questi eventi, come abbiamo imparato da De Finetti e da Baez, dire che si lo ritiene più probabile o meno probabile, indica solamente il nostro stato d'animo, delle valutazioni soggettive, non c'è alcuna maniera di dire se è probabile o improbabile, dipende molto dall'azione umana. E l'azione umana la facciamo noi. Come facciamo a fare i numeri? Muovendo il culo, muovete il culo. Ci vuole coraggio e dignità, grazie Alessia. Ci vuole coraggio e dignità. Ci vuole saper utilizzare il cervello per vedere le notizie negative e poi utilizzare il cervello e quella cosa chiamata dignità per agire positivo. Questo è il messaggio qui vi lascio. Siete addirittura aumentati, straordinario, siete diventati 600, cominciate a mettere quel fottuto like ovunque voi siate, anzi girate i 18 canali su cui siamo, no 6, c'è il LinkedIn di Alberto su LinkedIn, il YouTube di Alberto, YouTube mio, Twitch mio e gli X account sia di Alberto che miei. E quindi it's not over until the fat lady sings, scusate. No, sul fatto israeliano ho perfettamente ragione Akam 113. Chiunque sta condannando è un complice di un massacro immane che verrà ricordato nella storia come un'enorme tragedia e speriamo non peggiori, perché il problema vero è che peggiorerà. Quindi anche quello è un fattore cruciale e ve lo dico da 5 mesi. Non c'è vittoria in Ucraina senza riuscire a risolvere contemporaneamente e a depotenziare la questione israelo-palestinese, fino a quando non si ferma il massacro che Israele sta conducendo a Gaza. Non ci sarà. La vittoria in Ucraina richiede un'unità dei cittadini europei, dei cittadini occidentali. Senza l'unità dei cittadini occidentali, a fronte della minaccia russa, non c'è vittoria. Ricordatevelo, sono perfettamente convinto di aver ragione. Senza l'unità dei cittadini occidentali, senza la stragrande maggioranza, l'80, il 90%, deciso a combattere fino in fondo, non si arriva. E quando una fetta quando una fetta grande della società europea vede il doppio standard, vede l'ipocrisia, vede il nostro chiudere gli occhi a violenza immane, all'affamamento di centinaia, migliaia, milioni di persone, quell'unità salta. Per cui, occhio, non ci sono solo quelli pagati da Putin, non ci sono solo le spie russe in Italia e in Europa, ci sono anche personaggi dalla folle morale, dalla dubbia morale, dai plateali interessi politici che di fatto, compiendo quello che compiono, stanno dividendo la capacità europea di resistere alla Russia e di respingere l'attacco. Ok? Saluti e baci. Grazie e buona serata. Per gli abbonati al mio canale, un attimo. Bene, volevo dire che per gli abbonati al mio canale alle 22:30 faremo una asta privata per gli abbonati per finanziare appunto le borse di studio per ragazze palestinesi, 2 ragazze palestinesi a Gaza e niente, metteremo all'asta 2 quadri che Susannina ha offerto, quindi chi vuole partecipare si colleghi. Bene, grazie, a dopo, arrivederci, ciao ciao.